My mother couldn't come today, so I replaced her. Marcus Hale didn't look up from his phone when the maid entered his penthouse that morning. He never did. For 15 years, the same woman had arrived at 7:30, cleaned his marble floors, organized his life, and disappeared by noon like a shadow. He knew her rhythm. The soft shuffle of her shoes, the careful way she moved around his expensive things. But today, the footsteps were different, lighter, younger, wrong. Marcus glanced up. Standing in his foyer was a black woman he'd never seen before. Mid-20s, maybe. Simple uniform, hair tied back. She stood with her hands folded, waiting for him to acknowledge her, but there was something in her posture that didn't quite fit. She didn't shrink the way staff usually did in his presence. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, his tone sharp with annoyance. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she said calmly. "My name is Grace. My mother couldn't come today, so I replaced her." He stared at her for a moment, then returned to his phone. "Fine. Just do the job and don't break anything." Grace nodded once. Then she walked past him into the sprawling living room, and Marcus felt something he couldn't name. A flicker of unease. A question mark in a life that usually held only certainties. He told himself it was nothing. But deep down, he knew this day was going to be different. The Billionaire's morning. Marcus Hale lived in a world most people only saw in magazines. His penthouse overlooked the city like a throne room, floor-to-ceiling windows, marble imported from Italy, art worth more than most people's homes. He'd built a financial empire by the age of 35, and he wore his success like armor. People feared him. Employees stammered in meetings. Assistants triple-checked his coffee order. Even his own family walked on eggshells. That was how Marcus preferred it. Control was everything. Weakness was unacceptable. He sat at his dining table now, scrolling through stock reports while his breakfast sat untouched. The maid, Grace, she'd said her name was, moved quietly through the room, dusting shelves and straightening pillows. He barely registered her presence. To Marcus, staff were like furniture. Necessary but invisible. "Make sure you use the wood polish on the credenza," he said without looking up. "The other woman always forgets." "Of course," Grace replied. Her voice was steady, not timid, not eager to please, just steady. Marcus frowned slightly but said nothing. An hour passed. Grace worked methodically, moving from room to room. Marcus watched her occasionally from the corner of his eye. She didn't rush, didn't fumble. There was a precision to her movements that seemed almost deliberate, like every action had a purpose beyond cleaning. At one point, she paused in front of a photograph on his bookshelf. It showed Marcus shaking hands with a senator at some gala. She studied it for a moment, then continued dusting. "Something interesting?" Marcus asked, his tone cool. Grace turned to face him. "Just admiring the frame. It's beautiful craftsmanship." "It should be. It cost $3,000. "I see," she said quietly. Then she moved on. Marcus felt a prickle of irritation. Most people would have gasped at that number, would have fawned over his connections, his wealth, his proximity to power. But Grace had simply nodded and continued working. Who was this woman? The first test. By mid-morning, Marcus had decided to test her. "Grace!" he called out from his office. She appeared in the doorway within seconds. "Yes, Mr. Hale? I'm having guests tonight. Important guests. I need this place spotless. And I mean spotless. Not just clean. Perfect." Grace nodded. "Of course. I'm talking about the kind of clean where even dust is afraid to settle," Marcus continued, leaning back in his leather chair. "Your mother understands that standard. Do you?" There it was, the slight edge, the reminder of her place, the subtle suggestion that she might not measure up. Grace met his eyes calmly. "My mother taught me well, Mr. Hale. You'll have nothing to worry about." Marcus studied her face, searching for cracks, for nervousness, for the deference he was used to seeing. But Grace's expression remained composed, not defiant, not submissive, just present. "We'll see," he said dismissively. Grace returned to her work. Marcus returned to his computer, but found himself distracted. He kept glancing toward the living room where Grace moved with that same unhurried grace. She wasn't trying to impress him, wasn't seeking his approval. She was simply doing the work. And somehow that bothered him more than anything. Around noon, Marcus's assistant called. There was a problem with a merger. Numbers weren't adding up. Lawyers were threatening to walk. Marcus's carefully constructed deal was falling apart. He exploded. "Incompetent!" he snarled into the phone. "Every single one of you is incompetent. I pay you 6 figures to think, and you can't even read a contract properly." He slammed his laptop shut and stood, pacing like a caged animal. His breakfast sat cold on the table. His coffee had gone bitter. Everything felt wrong today. Grace emerged from the hallway with fresh linens. "Is everything all right, Mr. Hale?" she asked. "No," Marcus snapped. "Everything is not all right, and I don't need commentary from the help." Grace set down the linens carefully. "I apologize. I didn't mean to intrude." "Then don't," Marcus said coldly. "Just do your job quietly. That's what I pay for. Silence and service." Grace nodded and turned to leave. But as she did, Marcus saw something flash across her face. Not anger, not hurt. Something else. Something that looked almost like pity. "What?" he demanded. "Nothing, Mr. Hale," Grace said softly. "I'll finish the guest room." She left, and Marcus stood there in his multi-million-dollar penthouse, suddenly feeling very small. The afternoon dragged. Marcus tried to focus on salvaging his deal, but his mind kept wandering. He found himself listening for Grace's movements, the quiet efficiency with which she worked, the way she never asked questions but seemed to anticipate what needed doing. At 3 o'clock, she brought him tea, unprompted, unsolicited. "I didn't ask for tea," Marcus said. "No," Grace agreed. "But you've been working for hours without a break. I thought it might help." Marcus stared at the cup. Earl Grey, his favorite. How did she know? "Your mother told you," he said. "My mother tells me many things," Grace replied. Then she left before he could ask what that meant. Marcus sipped the tea. It was perfect. The right temperature, the right strength, and despite himself, he felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Who was this woman? At 4:30, his neighbor stopped by. Mrs. Chen from across the hall, an elderly woman who sometimes brought Marcus homemade dumplings despite his protests. Grace answered the door. "Oh," Mrs. Chen said, surprised. "You're not Helen." "I'm her daughter," Grace explained. "Grace, I'm filling in today." "Helen's daughter?" Mrs. Chen's face lit up. "Oh, she talks about you all the time. She's so proud of you, the work you do, the people you help." Grace smiled gently. "She exaggerates." "Nonsense. She showed me the article. The one about your organization. What you've accomplished is remarkable." Marcus appeared in the hallway. "Is there a problem?" Mrs. Chen turned. "No problem, Marcus. I was just meeting Helen's daughter. Such an impressive young woman." "Impressive," Marcus repeated flatly. "She's a maid." The words hung in the air like poison. Mrs. Chen's smile faded. Grace's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the room. Some invisible line had been crossed. "I should go," Mrs. Chen said quietly. She glanced at Grace with something that looked like sympathy, then left. Grace closed the door and turned to face Marcus. "Will that be all, Mr. Hale?" "Yes," Marcus said. "That will be all." Grace walked past him toward the kitchen, and for the first time that day, Marcus felt truly uncomfortable. By evening, the penthouse gleamed. Every surface shone. Every corner was immaculate. Marcus walked through the rooms, searching for flaws, finding none. Grace was in the foyer, gathering her things. "Wait," Marcus said. She turned. "You did good work today," he admitted grudgingly. "Better than I expected." "Thank you," Grace said simply. "Your mother, how long has she been sick?" Grace tilted her head slightly. "I never said she was sick." Marcus frowned. "Then why couldn't she come?" "Because I asked her not to," Grace said calmly. "I wanted to meet you myself." The words landed like stones in still water. "Why?" Marcus asked. Grace took a breath. "Because my mother has worked for you for 15 years, Mr. Hale. 15 years of arriving before you wake and leaving after you notice. 15 years of making your life comfortable while barely making enough to cover her own expenses. And in all that time, you've never once asked her name." Marcus opened his mouth to object, then stopped. Because it was true. He'd always called her the maid or the help, or simply given orders without preamble. Her name had never mattered to him. "Her name is Helen," Grace continued quietly. "Helen Patterson. She raised 3 children on a maid's salary, put them all through college, worked double shifts when my father got sick, sacrificed everything so we could have the opportunities she never did." Marcus said nothing. "I wanted to meet the man she talks about," Grace said. "The one she cleans for, the one who never says good morning, who never asks if she's tired, who treats her like she's invisible." "I pay her well," Marcus said defensively. "You pay her what she's worth to you," Grace corrected, "not what she's worth as a person. There's a difference." Silence filled the penthouse. "Who are you?" Marcus asked finally. Grace smiled sadly. "Does it matter?" "Clearly it does," Marcus said. "Mrs. Chen mentioned an article, an organization." Grace hesitated, then reached into her bag. She pulled out her phone, pulled up a news article, and handed it to Marcus. He read the headline. "Grace Patterson named Humanitarian of the Year for work with Homeless Youth Initiative." Below was a photo. Grace, wearing a formal dress, accepting an award from the mayor. The article described how she'd founded a nonprofit that had housed over 3,000 young people in the past 5 years. How she'd raised millions in funding. How she'd personally mentored hundreds of kids who'd aged out of foster care. Marcus looked up, stunned. "I'm my mother's daughter," Grace said quietly. "She taught me that everyone deserves dignity. That work is honorable, no matter what form it takes. That wealth and worth are not the same thing." Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest. "I came here today because I wanted to understand," Grace continued. "I wanted to see the man whom my mother serves without complaint, who she never criticizes, even when she comes home exhausted, who she prays for every night hoping he'll find happiness." "She prays for me?" Marcus whispered. "Every night," Grace confirmed. "Because despite everything, she believes there's goodness in you. She believes everyone deserves compassion." Marcus sank into a chair. His expensive suit, his powerful position, his billions. None of it felt like armor anymore. It felt like a prison. "I humiliated you today," he said hoarsely. "I called you the help. I dismissed you. You treated me exactly how I expected to be treated," Grace said. "Not because of who I am, but because of what you saw when you looked at me." The truth of it hit Marcus like a physical blow. "Your mother," he managed. Will she be back?" Grace nodded. "Tomorrow, if you still want her." "Of course Marcus stopped. "Does she want to come back?" "She needs the income," Grace said honestly. "But that's not why she'll return. She'll return because she doesn't give up on people, even when they don't deserve it." The reckoning Grace left. The door closed, and Marcus sat alone in his perfect penthouse, surrounded by perfect things, feeling perfectly empty. He thought about Helen, about 15 years of service he'd never acknowledged. Birthdays he'd never noticed. Holidays she'd probably worked. Human moments he'd never bothered to create because he'd never seen her as human. He thought about Grace, about how quickly he'd judged her, how easily he'd dismissed her, how certain he'd been of his own superiority simply because he had money and she appeared to be cleaning his floors. He thought about the person he'd become. Marcus stood and walked to his window. The city spread below him, millions of lives he'd never considered, people working jobs he'd never notice, making sacrifices he'd never appreciate, living with dignity he'd never acknowledge. For the first time in years, Marcus Hale felt ashamed. The morning after the next morning, Marcus woke early. He made his own coffee, straightened his own tie, and when Helen Patterson arrived at 7:30, he was waiting by the door. "Mr. Hale?" she said, surprised. "Is something wrong?" "No," Marcus said. "Nothing's wrong. I wanted to say good morning." Helen blinked. "Good morning." They stood in awkward silence. "Your daughter came yesterday," Marcus continued. "I know," Helen said quietly. "She told me." "She's remarkable," Marcus said. "What she's accomplished, what she's built. You must be very proud." Helen's eyes glistened. "I am." "She learned from you," Marcus said. "The way she carries herself, the dignity, the grace, that came from you." Helen nodded slowly. "I've been thinking," Marcus said. 15 years is a long time, and in all that time, I've never properly thanked you. I've never asked about your life, your family, your dreams. I've treated you like you were invisible." "Mr. Hale?" "My name is Marcus," he interrupted gently, "and I'd like to know yours." Helen smiled through tears. "Helen, my name is Helen." "It's nice to meet you, Helen," Marcus said, and he meant it. The change. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Marcus didn't become a saint. He didn't give away his fortune or abandon his business, but something fundamental had shifted. He started learning the names of his staff, asking about their families, noticing when they looked tired, saying thank you. Small things. Human things. He increased Helen's salary, not as a gesture, but as a correction, an acknowledgement of value long overdue. He donated to Grace's organization, not for publicity, but because the work mattered, and every morning when Helen arrived, he said good morning. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. But she was no longer invisible. One day, months later, Helen brought her family to a charity event Marcus was hosting. Grace was there. So were Helen's other children. They stood together, a family built on sacrifice and love and quiet dignity. Marcus watched them from across the room, and he thought about the day Grace had walked into his penthouse, the day she'd held up a mirror and forced him to see what he'd become. She'd left him speechless, not with anger or violence, not with speeches or accusations, but with truth. Simple, devastating truth. He'd spent his life believing money was power. That wealth was worth. That success meant superiority. But standing in that room, watching Helen laugh with her children, Marcus understood something he'd never grasped before. True wealth had nothing to do with money. True power came from lifting others up, and true worth was measured not by what you accumulated, but by how you treated people when you thought no one was watching. Years later, Marcus would tell this story. Not often, not publicly, but in quiet moments to people who needed to hear it. He'd talk about the day a black maid walked into his penthouse and changed everything, not by being extraordinary, but by being honest. "She didn't come to punish me," Marcus would say. "She came to understand me, and in understanding me, she helped me understand myself." People would ask what happened to Grace, to Helen, to that moment of transformation, and Marcus would smile. "Helen retired last year," he'd say, "with a pension that reflects what she always deserved. Grace's organization is now operating in 12 cities, housing thousands of young people. And me? I'm still learning, still growing, still trying to be worthy of the grace I was shown. But the most important thing I learned that day, Marcus would continue, it's this. We're all just people. Some of us have money, some of us have power, but underneath it all, we're all just people trying to live with dignity. And when we forget that, when we start believing our circumstances make us superior, we lose the only thing that truly matters: our humanity. In a world that measures worth by wealth, true richness is found in recognizing the humanity in everyone we meet. Money can buy comfort, but only compassion can buy connection. Status can command respect, but only kindness can earn it. And sometimes, the greatest education comes not from those above us, but from those we've spent our lives looking down upon.